never really know how to start these things off. Basically, what I'm going to be showing you how to do today is how you can use what you have to get good results. You don't need tons of professional gear. I was trying to think for a while, how am I going to do a camera test with the S21 to actually show off its capabilities? And I figured this is the perfect combination of two things that I was having issues with, was trying to figure out how to make a video of how to do like a product placement, just using things that you have at home. There was the missing aspect of keeping it cheap when I'm using a camera that originally cost me $3,000. That falls right back into that spectrum of what I've seen most YouTubers do, is they say like you can use what you have at home to make a really good video, really good photography. But when it comes down to it, they're still using thousands and thousands of dollars worth of camera gear to make it happen, and just substituting a few things like using natural lighting, a random lamp that they found at a thrift store, like little blankets and stuff as backdrops or whatever. But when it really comes down to it, you can get professional results doing all of that stuff because they're still using professional grade cameras. And for the S21 video, to demonstrate the camera capabilities, I couldn't really think of anything other than just shooting like a video montage of something. So I decided to combine both of them. So I'm going to show you how to make a fairly good like modern montage setup or product placement, something like that, using things that you have around the house, as well as shooting the entire thing on the S21 Ultra. So I'm going to be using literally things that most people will have around the house. And that's also not to say that you could just use the S21 Ultra. You can do this with any phone. You can do this with older cameras. But to demonstrate the full capability of the S21 Ultra, I'm going to be shooting the entire thing in 8K. I'm going to be editing it in 4K, so that way it matches up with the other cameras that I'm using throughout this video. So the main montage process is going to be the S21 Ultra. I'm recording right now on the GH4. I'm going to be using the S20 Ultra to show you some things around and what I'm doing. And then the entire montage section is going to be recorded on the S21 Ultra in 8K and then downscaled to 4K. So now first, I just want to show you how minimal these setups can be. I'll just show you a video of what I'm looking at and just kind of explain what's happening. So this is what I'm looking at right now. I have the GH4. It's rigged with a matte box, which isn't needed right now because I have all the lights off. There's no backlighting just because I'm sitting on the couch here. And then I have another tripod right here with my microphone on it. So that way the audio is closer to me. It's a Rode video mic. And then it's just a really long 3.5mm cable that's going all the way to the camera. So the camera is recording the audio on it. Then we come to the setup that I have here. So I have right here the Zephyrus Duo. That's the wrist rest that it comes with, and then a little like a laptop cooler stand thing or whatever that it's going to go on for the montage, because it has lights that match and everything. It props it up, gets better angles and everything. Then right here we have the S21 Ultra. So this is going to be what I'm going to be recording like the entire montage on. So this right here is my entire video setup. One rule that I want to point out for the best minimal lighting is the 45-45 rule. So if we are looking straight and we look 45 degrees to the side and then 45 degrees up, that's my key light. And that's generally the rule that you want to have it, is you always want to have it 45 degrees over from you and then 45 degrees up. And that's going to give the best lighting source directly on you. But right now, just sitting in the living room, that's not going to be a deal breaker. That's going to be enough lighting for this video that I'm making. And I want to continue using that in the actual product placement that I'm going to be doing. You could use a lamp. If you have other old cell phones, you could literally just prop them up with a flashlight app on. That also works. But the main thing that we want to get after here is not using artificial lighting. Now you can use artificial lighting. You can sit next to a window to have a nice soft light coming in on you. That would simulate something like this. This is a harder, cool light because it's an LED lamp that's non-adjustable. But if you wanted, you could use natural lighting in the same instance and set everything up right next to a window. The only thing is it doesn't have the repeatability. Repeatability doesn't really seem like something that you want to get into, but no matter how good you are, eventually it is going to be something that you run into where you've messed up a shot, you missed focus, or even an SD card corrupting, and then you have to reshoot a portion of your footage because some of it's gone. And using natural lighting is a really good introduction to this, but because it doesn't have the repeatability, so for instance, it could start off a nice sunny day, But then a cloud goes over the sun and suddenly it's soft light and a little bit less. So now your exposures are all different because the lighting changed. So it's a great way to start because that will get you into the instance where you're going to be adapting to the environment. And that's something that you always have to remember, is you always have to adapt to the environment. So even if you're shooting a video and you're going from in front of one object, which is in focus and the exposure set, and then you're going around the object to something else, say you're in a dark room, but you want to have visibility of the environment that you're actually in, and then you go over to a different room where your subjects or actors are, and you want to have the focus pull directly on them, as well as the exposure, so that way they're not under or overexposed depending on the previous environment. You have to always remember to be ready to change all of your settings. So when you're first learning how to do stuff like this, using natural light like the sun and setting everything up at a window is a great first start for lighting. So I wouldn't even recommend buying lights. I would recommend trying to learn how to do that. However, for the repeatability's sake, because like I mentioned, natural lighting can change. Even the time of day could change. You could be filming the entire thing during golden hour, so that way you have the best possible warm lighting and everything looks absolutely fantastic. And then the shoot could go on for so long, which I've actually run into this instance recording cars. By the end of the shoot, you've ran out of light. And if you don't film things in order, or you forget to take a shot, say you're shooting one car and you wanted to have the warm lighting reflecting off of the outside of the car, but then you forgot one or two special accents that you wanted to emphasize on in your video, that when you remember to go back to record that section, the lighting has changed. So then if you're trying to cut that into the same section as before, you're going to have a very definitive lighting difference between the two shots. So for this setup right here, I'm going to be using the minimal amount of lighting possible. So it's all very subjective. It depends on what you're doing. There's no definitive rule to all of this. It's all dependent on the look that you're going for. First, I'm going to show you my super sketchy setup and try to explain everything along the way. Okay, so now what I'm trying to set up here is I want to have depth. So I want to have essentially three elements. I want to have a background, so that's going to be the backdrop. It could be anything that you want to do. You could be shooting next to curtains, a wall. You could be shooting out the window, so that way you have a really long depth of field and have a better blurry background, so that way there's more emphasis on the actual product or object that you're actually filming. You want to have the actual product placement itself, the actual object that's in the frame, as well as the foreground objects. So that's not something that a lot of people are going to be thinking into, is the foreground objects, because you want to give depth. You want to have emphasis on what you're actually trying to show off, and by having nothing in the picture makes it very obvious that what you're trying to shoot is the actual product right in the center itself. But by having depth between different objects, some in the foreground, some in the background, and having the focal point right in the middle, then that adds emphasis. So that's saying that don't look at these blurry objects, look at the one in the middle, which then makes it more interesting to actually look at. So I'm going to throw some pictures up. These are just things that I shot a long time ago trying to explain this. So the first one is going to be just the MacBook Pro. I just have like a random piece of paper laying over top of the keyboard. That's just a completely flat, boring surface, so that way it takes away from anything that could be within the focal range. So then we have the screen, which is going to be a colorful image in the background. But because the screen is illuminated, that's also acting as the backlight for the product placement, which is not only going to be adding depth to the picture, but it's going to be adding an interesting background to it, as well as the backlighting that we want, so that way the foreground lighting isn't going to be creating such a contrast to the background. Then I just have two phones set up. I tried to use the 45-45 rule, but I didn't have enough space in front of the TV stand where I had everything set up. So it was close enough that I was able to make it work. Then you want to get the perspective down, and the best way to do this is to get at what you would assume is an eye-to-eye level with the product that you're actually taking a picture of. And then you just want to get your zoom, or in this case the crop, down, and then edit the photo into something that you want to use. So now this was just a picture of my watch sitting on a piece of paper on a laptop with a colorful image, and then two phones set up as lights. So it's not exactly the cheapest setup, because these are all very expensive items to be having, but again, you could be using a TV or your computer monitor or your laptop if the item is that small. These are examples of things that you could be doing around the house to actually make stuff like this happen. So for this one here, I'm going to be using the TV because it's wide enough that I can have the laptop sitting in front of it while not having bleed out onto the edges. So that way if the laptop is sitting close enough to the TV, right about here, when I'm shooting it from further away so I can get a better depth of field, because if you don't have a super shallow depth of field lens, if you don't have something that has a really large aperture, then you can zoom in, and by zooming in, you're taking physical depth into the object to make more depth into the background. So if you have a kit lens, which is usually an aperture of 3.5 to 5.6, depending on the zoom, if you zoom in to something like f4 and then physically move further away from your subject, then you're going to have a better depth of field, especially if you move the object away. So if I were to stand further away from the TV, move the laptop further out, and add physical depth between the subjects, then I'm going to establish a depth of field that I wouldn't have normally got if I had set everything up compressed. But with a lens that has a better aperture, so a larger aperture, then you can compress everything down to get that better depth of field. Again, there's no set rule to how any of this can be done. It's all subjective to what you have, what you want to do, the look that you're going for. So for this, just to demonstrate how janky you can actually set things up, I have these chairs set up here. I'm going to have to take the key light down because I need those chairs. And I'm going to set the chairs up in front of the TV, and I'm going to put the table on top of the chairs to give me the height to line up with the TV, so that way we're not looking up at the TV to ignore everything that's in the bottom. So now I'm just going to measure the table to see how far apart the legs are, and they're about 33 inches apart, so that way we can make roughly the center of the chairs 33 inches apart. Just a little bit, that'll be fine. These are 33 apart, so this chair has to come out a little bit. Okay, that'll be good. Okay, now we gotta move the table. I want to have this closer to the TV. I'm gonna move this in. So this is the setup. This is what I'm going to be using for the product placement. Now, you could shoot on the table itself if you want. For me, I want a colder surface, so that way it emphasizes the laptop because it has kind of a blue tone to it. So I'm going to be using a blanket that's kind of like a grayish blue color, so it matches fairly well. But again, subjective. If you wanted to make the laptop look more warm and homey, then you could very easily just use this surface, have maybe a fireplace as the background image, or like a volcano or something, just abstract slow motion footage, and you could have a warm environment to actually put the computer on. But because of the color, I want to emphasize on that, because the laptop is not gray, it's actually blue. But if I put enough blue around it, then it's going to look more gray, because it's going to take away from the actual color of the computer itself, but still emphasize it because of the accent colors. So I have this blanket from Chapters. Done. Awesome. Now, one thing to keep in mind when you're using a blanket is when you put something on it, it's going to have depth, so it's going to push in. So if you want to have side shots of the actual product itself, you're going to want to raise it up. So I'm going to be using this laptop stand. Now I just want to put the laptop down. Done. That's the setup. So now I just need to find some kind of abstract blue-ish video to play. So I'm just going to search for like slow motion waves or something, or like oceanscapes. So that way we have a lot of white and blue. It'll also match the background and the color scheme that I have going on with the LEDs. So we have some random slow motion ocean waves as the background. So that's going to be our moving abstract wallpaper. Then we have wallpaper on the computer that matches the background, the whole theme that we're going for. The LEDs on the keyboard are blue and white to simulate the waves. We then have this accent here on the stage essentially, which then complements the actual grayish blue of the laptop itself. So now everything is corresponding with each other. So I just have to get rid of this warm light. I'm going to take the LED light and we can move it around for our different shots. We can even accent the lighting as being an illustration piece. So if we were to take in a camera view from here, we could emphasize on the shadows going across the keys and the reflections off of the edges of them. So there's tons of different elements that you could actually use in this to utilize a single light source just to get the image that you're actually looking for. But for right now, everything is essentially set up the way that I want it to be set up, so now we just have to shoot the entire thing on the S21 Ultra. So now, one thing with the S21 Ultra is if you're going to be shooting video on it, the manual settings for video only work on the main camera. I'm not entirely sure why they did this, but you can only use the 108 megapixel camera. It doesn't matter if it's 8K or not. You could be shooting 720p and it's still only going to use that one camera. So in order to utilize the zoom lens to get the better depth of field that I was talking about, I'm going to be shooting everything on auto, which really sucks, but that's the fact of the matter. I have to work with what I have. So choosing between manual settings and being able to zoom, I'm going to be choosing zoom just because of the actual elements that we're working with here. Completely forgot about my own rule. We need foreground objects. Candle, throw a white one in the back, the blue side of the Red Magic 5G. Yeah, it's just moving stuff around, playing with what you got, trying to figure it out. The lighting isn't something that needs to be perfect. There's not going to be any continuity errors with the lighting because it's always going to be moving. So for instance, if I wanted to take a shot of the keyboard right now, and from where I'm standing, I have a nice reflection off of all of the keys, and I want to bring the reflection down to the bottom, I'm going to put the light at kind of a head-on angle, and I'm going to get a lower shot of the keyboard and try and get more movement into it. Now I'm going to start at the top left corner, and I'm going to rotate, but then also kind of pan down toward the trackpad. So, starting at the top left, going down to the bottom right with a slight rotation. There we go. So that's the first shot. Easy. So I just went from this corner up here, all the way down to this corner here, going from the corner, and then rotated the phone, as well as panning down at the same time. So now, I'm just going to keep doing this until I have all of the shots that I want, and then from there, we're basically done, and we've made the product placement using an S21 Ultra. So now I just get to shoot the rest of this video. Awesome, camera died. Don't you love it when that happens? So I shot everything, I've edited it all together, and you've just finished watching the entire video that I ended up making using the S21 Ultra, using very minimal things that I had laying around the house. Literally chairs, a table, a blanket, a TV, some random candles, a phone just as backdrop things because the color kind of matched, and then a laptop. Like, you can use whatever you want to make videos like this. And then just to show you that you can actually make budget videos like this, I filmed the entire thing with the S21 Ultra. Not to say that's a budget phone, but you could use any phone to make things like this. I'm just showing off the camera capabilities of that phone, which you've seen from the results. It looks fantastic. Like, that's from a phone. How? Like, what happened to phones over the last few years? You can use these as entry-level cinematography cameras. Like, that's insane. Like, obviously this one, I had to shoot the entire thing in auto because for whatever reason they don't let you use the zoom lenses with manual settings. But that could easily be fixed in software. But that's just one of the things that I wanted to essentially illustrate here, is you don't need to have tons of stuff to start this. You can use things that are around the house and your phone. You have everything that you need right now to start making videos, to start doing photography. And one of the things that I found the most struggling with motivation is you don't get motivation until you're actually doing it. So think of anything that you've done in the past where you just didn't want to do it and you didn't want to get up to actually make it happen. So think about when you were a little kid and you had to take a bath and you would fight that as if it was the end of the world, and then once you're in there, you don't want to get out
That's exactly what happens. Once you're in there, you have the motivation to stay in there because the experience is fun and something that you wanted to do. But going to do it is something that you will naturally fight yourself to do, and getting into the habit of forcing yourself to do something so that you actually have motivation to do it is extremely hard for a lot of us, especially during COVID and not being able to leave the house, which right now Canada's in full lockdown. So we can't travel more than a kilometer away from our house, which is 0.6 miles for the US people. So we can't even go more than half a mile away from our house. But you could still go in the front yard, backyard. You could do things in the living room, taking pictures, making a video. Do something that you will look back on years later and cringe at how bad what you created was. Because if you become something that you can be proud of when you're doing things like this, then it doesn't matter how bad it was, because you can look back on it and laugh. But you'll never know until you actually try to do the things that you want to do. So that's just something that you should take from this video, more than the setup and everything that I've done right now, is you have a phone. You can go out and you can start taking pictures. And if you're watching this video, then you probably have some take of interest into photography or cinematography. Right now, take your phone. Go take pictures. Don't dive into manual photography like an idiot, like everyone tells you to do. There are so many cocky photographers that I've run into in my days where they say, oh, manual is best. If you shoot auto, you're an idiot. I just shot this entire thing on automatic with a phone. I used, to the best of my abilities, what I had offered. The phone doesn't have manual settings with the zoom lens, and I wanted the depth of field of using a zoom lens. So by needing that aspect, using automatic settings was the best option for me. Would I have preferred manual? Of course. I could have adjusted exposures and everything differently, have manual focus control, but I use it to the best of my ability. And that's something that a lot of people won't do, is if it doesn't do the exact thing that you want it to do, they won't do it because it's just something that someone will leech onto as an excuse to not do something. But one of the main things that I always try to get people to look into, shoot within your ability. Don't try and push yourself out of your comfort zone when you're first starting. That's one of the stupidest things you can do. That's one of the easiest ways to get burnt out. And it's the most common reason that people stop doing something that they had interest in. When I first got a DSLR, it was so complex, I would shoot in auto. And everyone would make fun of me for it. I then started learning more about the camera. I learned about aperture priority. So that way I wanted the shallow depth of field photos, like the pro photography photos, or as every kid knows it now with a phone, portrait mode. You can just lock the camera in aperture priority. So that way you can set the aperture to what you want. So that way you can get the shallow depth of field if that's what you wanted, or you could get those blooming light flares if you use like f8 or something like that. But you can lock that in, and then your ISO and shutter speed, or shutter angle if that's what you're using, like this one, they automatically adjust. So that way it's like auto, but you still have the manual control of changing your aperture. Using auto is not this red flag of amateur photographer. It's the way you should be starting. You should never dive into something that you're unprepared for. It's just like getting a job. You need to be qualified for most jobs, or at least get training before you know what to do. Being a cinematographer is no different than that. You need to start learning somewhere, and everyone does. Everyone knows nothing about a topic before learning about it. And it seems that a lot of professionals that I run into forget this, because they will criticize everything about you, which makes you completely lose interest in it, because you don't even want to be around people like this, and you don't want to take anything they have as consideration because they're so condescending about the way that they say it. And this is kind of a downfall of all trades, is you always end up seeming to get the older, experienced people who know what they're doing, but rather than trying to help you and get you to understand what's actually happening, they criticize everything that you're doing and tell you to stop doing that. Ghosts. But instead of actually helping you try to figure out what's going on, they criticize everything that you do. And they tell you that, oh, using auto is stupid. Like, why did they even have auto on a camera? Well, it's for learning. So that way you can learn more about how to actually set up a photo or set up a video. So using rule of thirds, golden ratio, learning different exposures, different lighting sources. You could then use foreground and background objects like I was doing here. There's so many different elements to taking a picture rather than how the camera works. Those are two completely separate elements. There's essentially your three settings. There's your ISO adjustment, which is the gain of the sensor, so that's how much light it lets in. And then there's the shutter speed, which for photography, you essentially just set it to be as fast as what you want it to be, but not entirely. So again, it's subjective. It depends on what you're shooting. If you're shooting a still object, you have all the time in the world, then use a tripod. Set your shutter speed to whatever you want to compensate for the exposure, so that way you get a good exposure. You want your ISO to be as low as possible, so that way you get the least amount of grain that you can in the photo. But if you're shooting a fast moving object, so for instance sports, and you want to have the action perfectly in focus, then you're going to want to bump that shutter speed up so it's faster, so it'll click faster, get less movement out of the picture. But again, you can also use that subjectively to what you want to actually shoot. So if you're doing a rolling shot of a car and you have the shutter speed set too high, it's going to snap a picture so quickly that the background is even going to be in focus, and it's just going to look like a car sitting on a road not moving. So by then introducing the motion into the picture, you want to bring that shutter speed down. So that way you have enough shutter speed to snap a picture of the car sharply, but not enough that the wheels and the background are still in motion. So the wheels will still look like they're spinning, the background will still have motion blur going by. So there's so many different elements to actually learn into using the camera to get the shots that you want, that I always think it's better to learn how to shoot photography than it is to learn your camera. Which is why I always tell people, start with your phone. It's a great source. They have great cameras now on phones. Like the newest phones that come out today are ridiculous. They're better than most point and shoot cameras that were out only a few years ago. So as a result of this is take your phone, shoot on auto, but learn about photography. Learn rule of thirds, golden ratio. If you have a higher end Android phone, you can shoot RAW. And then you have tons of flexibility with editing. You can bring a lot of the picture back from that point to get even more professional results, to simulate a higher end camera with a wider dynamic range from a phone shooting RAW just by doing some more editing. You could learn lookup tables, so that way you could start shooting in a way where you're prepared for the lookup table that you're going to be using to apply the color correction to your picture or video. So learning about how to shoot a picture is significantly more important, in my opinion, than actually learning how the camera works. The few elements that you have in a camera, they come naturally once you start shooting. I can just pick up a camera and then I know to change the ISO to whatever I want for the situation that I'm shooting in, change the aperture to what I'm actually trying to achieve, either a really sharp picture, a really warm picture, soft, and then just change the shutter speed to whatever I need for the shoot that I'm shooting. Like there's those three elements for any picture, and that's essentially all you ever need to know. Once you learn how to utilize each of those three settings and then in combination with each other for whatever you're shooting, it becomes so easy that that's where the narcissism comes from of all of these experienced people criticizing the younger generations who are trying to get into photography by calling them out and asking why they're using automatic when it's so easy. But they forget that when they first start, these are very confusing elements. You have to understand what all of these different spectrums of ISO mean. What is a native ISO? Do you want to use an underclocked ISO if your native ISO is higher? What shutter speed should I be using? So there's just those three elements that you want to get into for photography, but it is so in-depth for each piece that it's a huge learning curve, and that's what everyone forgets. So I wouldn't put that huge learning curve on your first step into photography. I would start learning about how to take a picture, how to frame a picture, find your horizons, learn about negative space and the golden ratio. There are so many different elements that you could be looking into that learning your camera isn't always the most necessary thing to do, which is why using your phone gives you that flexibility of having something automatic in your pocket, ready to go whenever you want to shoot a picture. You can shoot a picture of whatever you want. You could practice zooming to simulate depth of field. There are so many different things that you could practice doing on your phone that you don't even need to go out and buy a camera. So there's really no excuse as to why someone shouldn't be a photographer when you have a phone and you have an interest. That's all you need. It doesn't even have to be a good phone. It could be like an old phone from like 2014. I was using that Lumia 950 XL just fine. The night pictures weren't perfect, but at least it was usable. I could still use it. The daytime picture is flawless. Full manual control. You can shoot RAW. It's a great phone from 2014. You can pick it up on eBay for like $200 Canadian. So there's really no excuse to not actually do these things. It's just about getting to do it so you can create the motivation to keep doing it. You really have no excuse to not try. And that's the biggest thing, is you have to try to know your limitations. And then when you try again, you then have benchmarks. Okay, so that last shot was a little bit dark. I have to remember to focus on my exposure. The last shot was a little bit shaky. Okay, I have to get my hands a little bit more steady. Maybe look into getting a gimbal or a glide cam. Those are great alternatives. But maybe the audio wasn't as good, which is something that I've always had problems on this channel because I didn't learn anything about audio. Like, I produce music, but that's entirely self-taught. So every time I'm doing something, I'm always trying to improve the mistakes that I made the last time. So if you go back on any of the 3 channels and just watch the old videos, they're really bad. There's so many audio mistakes, there's so many editing mistakes, some of them aren't even edited at all. And it's not that I just magically got better over time and just kept doing the same mistakes over and over. I would review the old videos to learn my mistakes, so that way I can improve the future videos based on the mistakes that I made. Because you'll never improve unless you make mistakes. You can start right now. You can go start learning photography or cinematography. Go make something so awful that you would cringe at it later. Go become someone so good that when you look back on this, you laugh at how much you struggled to get to where you are. So if you found something useful in this video, then feel free to like it. Or subscribe to the channel. That's cool. Or don't do any of it. I'm not telling you what to do.